Hey guys, happy new NHRA season week. The Gator Nationals are this weekend, so big excitement for the upcoming NHRA season. But we start the season honestly on a somber note, because the end of last season we all lost Don Schumacher, and so for this show specifically, w- we never had an opportunity to have Don Schumacher on this show, although he has been in the magazine a lot with Drag Illustrated and a lot of interviews in Drag Illustrated, but we did not have an opportunity to have him on this show. And so what we've done here is got together and did some interviews with four of his really good friends and mates, and people, suppliers, people who've been employees for him, and ultimately just became friends, to do a tribute here of his life, and then also for that, so that you can get an opportunity to really understand who Don Schumacher was as a man, also as a business person, and learn some of the advice from some of his friends here. So this week we're going to do a Don Schumacher tribute show. So let's get to business, the racing business. So to get us started here on the Don Schumacher tribute show, our first guest is Mr. Schumacher, is one of his best friends in the world, who was also a guest here last week on the racing business, Brett Underwood. So we'd like to go ahead and bring Brett as our first guest here on the tribute show. So how are you doing today, Brett?
Hi guys, how are you? How are you, Jason?
I'm doing good, doing good. So we're here for the Don Schumacher tribute show, and and I think everyone that I talked to, they're like, "Well, make sure that we get Brett on this show," because they were very good friends. So in the spirit of both a great tribute and in the spirit of the show, a racing business show, we'll talk about Mr. Schumacher, talk about some of the things that you guys worked in business together, and just who is he as a person, as a business person, and what are some of the things that some of the advice that just learnings and just advice that you can give from his life. So I'll sort of throw that out there. Wherever you start is fine, and I'll ask you some questions along the way.
Okay. I'll say one thing. Don Schumacher and I were very good friends. Very fortunate to be part of the family, I guess you'd say. Going down there for the holidays, whether it's New Year's, Christmas, Thanksgiving. Been fortunate enough to travel all over the world with him, golfing, fishing. Helped him on a lot of his drag racing programs. Helped put together some pretty good sized programs for him over the years. It was a very tough holiday for me when I got the call on the night of December 20th that Don had passed away. I had originally tried to go down to see him. I was going to fly down on Monday morning after the PRI show in December. Basically got the call on Sunday afternoon that not to come, that he was back in the hospital. And part of me says, I'm glad I didn't go, because I want to remember Don the way that I knew Don. I mean, I was very fortunate. I went up and down a lot of roads together, spent a lot of time, a lot of miles. Just a very, very good man. Learned a lot from him business wise. One thing I will say about Don, he's probably the most competitive person I've ever met in my life, whether it was fishing, playing golf. I could tell you stories that would curl your hair. That
I got none.
he wanted to win every round at drag racing. He wanted to win every hole at golf. He wanted to catch every fish in that ocean. Just
Yeah.
a very, very competitive person. A lot of fun. I was fortunate enough to get to see the other side of Don that a lot of people don't get to see. Don was a very good businessman, but Don was a very private person. Don didn't let a lot of people in, and that was just his way. Um, you know, he
Yeah.
was a very private person, him and his family. Like I said, was very fortunate. How I met him was in the back of Bob Stangy's bus, the gentleman that owns Strange Engineering. Probably right, I want to say probably 1997. We were sitting in the back of Bob's bus. Don came on and had his wife and daughter, Megan. Megan, I think, was 6 years old at the time. On my refrigerator over here, I can show you a picture of Megan sitting on my lap. six, 6 years old. I, at the time, was working with Mattel Toy Company, ended up bringing her Barbie dolls to the races, and we just hit it off, me and the family. My job at that time was to kind of help look after the wife and the daughter. Don at that time had 7 or 8 fuel teams, so he was going here, going there, ended up starting some pro stock teams. So Don was busy when he was at the track, and I kind of helped keep an eye on Sarah and Megan at that time.
Gotcha. And what was the first business deal that you guys did together?
Helped him bring Valvoline to the table. A good friend of mine, Mike Gruber, ran the Valvoline program out at the racetrack. And him and I, at that time, we didn't have an oil deal. Don did not. And so I went with Mike, ended up meeting with Mike's bosses, and we ended up bringing Don to the table, and brought Valvoline the first time around, and numerous times. And they end up leaving the sport a few years later, and ended up bringing Valvoline back to the table years later, on Johnny Gray and his son's car when Johnny went to a funny car. Interesting story. We were in Las Vegas smoking a cigar, Don and I, and he said, "What are you hearing?" And I said, "You don't want to know that the word on the street that Johnny Gray wants to go funny car racing." And he says, I said, "The word on the street, he's going to take $2 million of his money and $2 million of Tire Kingdom's money, and he's going to go and start a funny car operation or buy a funny car operation." Don kind of looks at me and kind of shrugs and says, "Well, why don't he give us that money?" And he said, "Want me to make that happen?" And he said, "Well, I'm not going over there." So I ended up going over and meeting with Johnny Gray. We ended up meeting that night at the Bellagio Hotel there at the piano bar, myself, Don, Johnny Gray, and his wife, Terry. And we ended up talking and ended up calling the people at Tire Kingdom and wanted to know what kind of oil they were pouring at the time. And at that time, they were 80% down the road with Quaker State, but they had not signed any deal with Quaker State. We ended up calling Valvoline, getting the guys from Valvoline to Las Vegas the next day, end up sitting down together and end up putting together, and it became a big deal for Valvoline. They went into all the Tire Kingdom stores. So we ended up winning a championship with Jack Beckman with Valvoline on the car.
Wow. And so a lot of people, don't really know how some of those sponsorship deals come together and like where to provide value in that. But I guess when you talk about someone like Don, who had all the different, well, and you also that have all the different B2B connections, it was, sounds like that sponsorship deal sort of paid for itself before it even started by getting into all the Tire Kingdoms.
It did. And a lot of times, whether it was a tool deal, whether it was an oil deal, worked with Don, learned a lot from Don, and a lot of it was B2B deals. That the days of just putting a sticker or your name on the side of a race car are not out there any longer. That, you have to have a return on investment for both sides, and learned a lot from Don over the years, business wise. And he helped me in my career quite a bit. One thing I learned, if you tell somebody you're going to do something, make sure you do it.
Yeah. What are some of the other things that you learned, either that he told you or you just learned? I mean, I'd never actually had an opportunity to speak with him, but I learned so much just by observing him. Like, what did you learn both by being his friend and also by observing what he did?
Learned one thing: don't ever give up. One thing I learned about Don, being around him as much as I did, he put in the time and he put in the work. Nothing was handed to him. When we'd go fishing, he'd be the first one up, the last one down. Whether we were in Florida at his house playing golf, he'd be in there on the computer first thing when I'd come down the steps. We'd get in the car, go eat breakfast at night. Before he went to bed, he was in there on that computer, making sure everything was handled for the day. So one thing I learned about Don is you got to put in the time. You got to put in the work. That, nothing happens without a lot of hard work. One thing I did learn from him is he said there's 2 ways you can beat people: you outwork them or you buy them. And I his battery charger business at the end, I think they had over 90% of the worldwide market in battery chargers. And a lot of that came from Don and his hard work and his teams that, he put together. At the end, he had over 3,000 employees before he sold the company. So you got to put in the time and you got to put in the effort if you want to be successful out there. Don't ever give up. You know, I mean, I've seen sponsors come, seen sponsors go. We always ended up, you know, finding another sponsor to replace one that had left or that had fallen to the wayside. You know, be positive, don't give up, and keep moving forward.
Gotcha. Well, anything else before we round this segment out? Anything else that you want to leave the audience with of as a tribute to Mr. Schumacher?
A lot of great memories. Like I said, I've been fortunate, got to fish all over the world, got to play golf at golf courses all over the world. Just one thing I've learned about, you know, I'm very competitive myself, but, you know, I never scratched the surface when it came to Don. Don was probably the most competitive person I've ever met in my life, and was thankful enough to be a good friend. And that's how I'll always remember my friend.
Awesome. Well, thank you for helping us remember him also.
Thank you.
So our next guest is Jeff Stange from Strange Engineering. And in Jeff's case, there's actually two big losses, but two back-to-back losses. One, as most of you guys know, his pops, Bob Stange, the founder of Strange Engineering, passed away earlier last year. And then Don Schumacher later in the year. So you know, in this case, we'll pretty much allow as much time as we need to for a tribute. Make sure that we're honoring both lives and both contribution to the racing business. So our next guest is Jeff Stange. How are you doing today, sir?
Good. How about you?
Doing pretty good. Yeah. So you know, definitely you know, in the list of people who are super close to Don Schumacher. You know, you were one of the people who were brought up in the list there, and also your dad. So I guess there, just where does the story start there?
Well, my father was very close friends with Don through the probably late 50s, 60s, and then, you know, from until they both passed away. You know, they met through racing. You know, just about all of my father's friends were through, you know, community and growing up in the racing industry. Don was also local, so Don lived in Park Ridge. My father grew up in Evanston, which are suburbs of Chicago, so they lived about 30 minutes apart. And back in the 60s, 70s, I'm sure you're aware, Chicago was very active as far as drag racing, legal, illegal, or whatever was going on in that time period. They became very good friends. My dad had a lot of respect for Don, and you know, through that, growing up in that environment, I was around Don since I would say, a teen, as far as my memory can go back. Don was always very good with me. And I think in my professional life, even starting in 20s, I went to college, and then right after college, I came here and I worked Strange, I think, in summers since I was like 12. So I kind of grew up in the industry, and I had a few mentors, and Don he is one of those, where, you know, it was probably, I never really thought about it, but a 25, 30-year age gap. But he always treated me like an adult, even though he was a mentor. So even when I was in the 20s, I was fortunate to be around a lot of my father's friends became my friends. And you know, I was very fortunate for that wisdom. And they all, for whatever reason, treated me as an adult. So when we talked, they would mentor, listen to my ideas, you know, banter with me on their ideas. And we would, obviously, from different generations, so we had different ideas. But they always listened to me, and always, I felt, respected me. And I was very, very lucky. And I had the utmost respect for quite a few of those people. And Don was certainly one of them.
Yeah. We always talk about different concepts and stuff like that, and one of which is diversification. And we sometimes forget about, like, just age diversification of,
yes, yeah,
you know, actually just treating younger folks or older folks as you know, also having some input and different things like that. So that's awesome. That's an awesome lesson to hear. How about any other memories?
You know, as far as my father and Don, I know my father would play poker with Don, and that would probably be in the late 60s. And Don would host, or Don's father would be part of the host of having poker parties at their house, you know, on a weekend night. So my father would always tell that story where he would go there, and there was food everywhere. Anything you wanted to drink was there. And he had commented to Don and Don's father of, why do we have all this stuff? And his father said, because we never want to run out for our guests, right? And so the story is the story affected my father throughout his life. So if you've ever been to dinner with my father or my father's or a strange dinner, we definitely never ran out of anything. We always overordered. So I think that's something that he carried from a young age for his entire life. Whenever we had a party or a get together, it was always, overdone, if you will.
Gotcha.
So I think that's, as far as Don goes, he was always a mentor to me. So anytime I'd have trouble in business or I want to run something by, and keep in mind, a lot of times, and in our industry, it's pretty common that you might only talk to somebody once a year, 3 times a year. So Don, I would probably either see or have conversations with him 2 to 3 times a year. And most of them were quality conversations. Sometimes he would call me if he wanted to run something by me, or I would call him, for some ideas, or we'd have breakfast, whether it's personal or business. But he always carved time out for me, and I know he was a very busy man.
Gotcha.
But go ahead.
I was just gonna say, what is it like getting a call from Don Schumacher and him needing something from you? Like, what was that like?
It's pretty cool. I had a lot of people that I would interact with in that way. Don was one of them, or Austin Coyle was one of them throughout his life and career. Warren Johnson. So there's a lot of people where it's very rewarding because they're all a little bit older than me, anyways. But we were always working on something. We were trying to develop products. Trying to make things better all the time. So I would have conversations with them. My dad would have different conversations with them. It's, I've had a very fortunate life in this industry to meet a lot of great people and interact. And I still do. Now I'm probably one of the older guys. So now I listen very carefully to the younger people, people in their 20s or 30s, and try to adapt to what's going on, as far as the sport evolving.
What are some of the big business lessons that you learned from Don Schumacher?
Loyalty. I would say Don and my father. Loyalty would be the biggest lesson, and I don't mean. I mean loyalty is as far as trust and working with somebody. So it's a personal relationship. Those are just something you can't replace. So you have faith, because in business, just for us, we've made top fuel runs since the 70s, and we still make them today. We probably have 70%, 80% of that market. But however, it's about less than 1% of our business, but it's still a source of passion for me, and engineering challenge. So when you go through changes on rear ends, sometimes they're very abrupt, meaning you might have a design that, starts to get, the gear life starts going away during the year, because we never know where the cliff is. But Don, through those changes, always stayed with us, worked with us. Even when things were on the down, he would try to help. He would, never anything negative. We'd work on ideas and progress, and eventually would make it better. So when I say loyalty, I mean, a relationship to work and trust each other, that we're all in it trying to make it better, whatever it is. In our case, it might be product.
Gotcha.
So, and my father was very, very loyal that way.
Gotcha. Well, how about in that vein, what are some of the lessons that you learned from your dad to make sure that we memorialize both in this segment?
It's very, very aligned. My father was very big on people, listening to people. I mean, for a lot of, I would say for me, just the respect that you give whoever, I don't care if it was Don Schumacher or person X that is just starting to build his car. They get my same attention. I work the sales office on purpose, just as Jeff, not Jeff Stange, but just as Jeff, because I love that interaction with people. I think that's, the bottom line is you have to be genuine with people, and you have to share your passion and also listen and accept their passion. So I think it doesn't matter who they are. They deserve, if they're in front of me, they deserve my time as best as I can get it and to listen to them. So I don't really distinguish between, let's say, Don Schumacher or, somebody that's 21 years old that needs some advice on axles. I treat them the same. And I did learn that from my father.
Any final words to memorialize two great people?
No, they're missed. As you can see, I'm getting a little choked up. I wasn't really ready for my father conversation with Don, but I mean, they're missed. They'll never be forgotten. I think the lessons that the people that they've touched, will always have part of them in them. I know I do. I'll never forget those lessons. I'm very, very appreciative of both of them.
Yeah. Well, we thank you for, one, condolences for the double loss, and thank you for sharing the story so that we, here on the show. Unfortunately, we didn't get an opportunity. Well, actually, we didn't get an opportunity to interview either. So thanks for sharing the story.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, guys, we keep rolling along here. Our next guest, you guys all know, just world-renowned tuner, crew chief, but also really good friend to Don Schumacher. So our next guest is Mr. Ron Tobler. So let's go ahead and bring on Ron Tobler. How you doing today, sir?
I'm doing good, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for coming on, also coming on in such short notice. But I guess probably the first thing that I noticed is that shirt. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Don had a couple of hobbies, one being golf and one being ocean fishing. And when I first became friends with him, it was on a trip to the Dominican Republic to go down there because his boat was there, and we fished and golfed. And I subsequently went to probably 5 or 6 more DR trips, as we call them. Been to Costa. Then he moved the boat to Costa Rica, so we went to Costa Rica to go on the boat and fish. But he was definitely an avid fisherman, and boating was a big part of his life.
Yeah, I live down in Fort Lauderdale, so I know all the different types of boats. That looks like a heck of a fishing boat.
It is. And this is the one that he had like during the middle 2000 teens, but he went on after he sold Schumacher Electric and kind of retired from everything and the drag race team and all that. He bought, I believe, 2 more and kept one in Africa because the marlin fishing in Africa was much better than the marlin fishing here. So he was very avid with it, and it was a lot of his time away from his businesses was spent on the boats.
Gotcha. So let's start your relationship with Mr. Schumacher. Where does that start?
Well, I was working for a guy named Cruz Pedregon. My first fling in a funny car in 08 and 09. And in the middle of 09, Don came to me and said that he had an opening, at DSR. And at that point, I was really wanting to get back on a dragster and get away from this funny car thing. But he said, no, all he had was funny cars. So I was just happy to go to work with him. Even if it was working on his car in the parking lot, I would have done that. And so I started there full time in 2010. And
were you guys already friends or
no, we were not friends. I mean, okay. I had competed. I was a crew chief for Doug Coletta in 04, 05, and 06. Mm-hmm. So the 3 best cars in those 3 years in Top Fuel was Tony Schumacher, Doug Coletta, and probably Brandon Bernstein. So I competed really hard against Don, me as a crew chief for another team, and his as a team owner with Alan Johnson. And I got to know him then, but certainly not on a personal level. Whenever we exchanged wins or whatever, we would congratulate each other. There was the famous run of 2006 when Tony Schumacher set the national record and took that possible first championship away from Doug Coletta. So I knew him then, but he paid me a very good compliment that when he asked me to come to work for him, he told me that I was one of the only people that could compete with Alan Johnson. And that was a very big compliment to me. So I was very fortunate to have that offer, and that's where I ended my career.
And where was your first? Where was your first funny car with Schumacher Racing?
Actually, with Jack Beckman. It was the Valvoline car, and it had some Aaron's rental livery on it for the first couple of years. And then in 2012, the Napa car, which was really one of the big funny cars that he had a very highlighted sponsor, brought a lot of money into the business, and he switched me from Beckman's car to Caps's car in April of 2012. And I stayed with Ron through the 2020 season. And Ron and our team won 33 races together. So we were very successful in the 8 years that we ran there. Finished first in the points once, second twice. And, Don just gave us all the equipment, the people, and the things that we needed to go out and be successful.
Yeah, that was the question that I was going to ask. Just on the business side of it, and we'll get more to the tribute side, but just from the business side of it, like, what was it like competing versus Don versus working with him and partnering with him, and like, what were just some of the big differences that you noticed immediately?
Well, I don't think there was really much of a difference. I mean, Don was always a very personable guy, even when I raced against him. And but like I said, I didn't know him personally. I didn't know him as an employer. And back in those days, it was always, well, where I worked, it was, Schumacher was the dark side. You don't go to the dark side, but I almost took that as a compliment because they paid attention to what he did, and he had a very good business model. He only started his race teams in 1999, when he came out with one car for his son, Tony. And by the time I got there, I think he was up to 5 or 6 cars. And at the height of Schumacher racing in 15, 16, 17, 18, he had 7 fuel cars. Right. So he certainly knew how to run a business and spread it out, and added a lot to both classes that he competed in.
What talking about, knowing how to run a business, what are some of the things that you noticed on the business side, or some of the things you learned from him, and or some advice that you have for the community of just watching him and being around him?
Well, one of the things that I noticed was that back in the days, in the early 2000s, a lot of these teams like Coletta's and John Force and Don Schumacher were wanting to build a lot of their own parts and equipments. And it started with the chassis. So they had in-house chassis shops, which you get to control everything there. And then he started to really build a lot of parts for the race car, whether it be cylinder heads, or I think at one point in time, we had 200 parts in our car that we got from Don Schumacher machine. And so I think his business model, as far as that goes, is it's cheaper to build it himself than it is to buy it from an outside person. And he could control the quality, and all those things were really good. And you could keep inventories that we all needed, because a lot of times these manufacturers can't keep up with the inventory that these big mega teams need. So I learned that from him. I also saw from him that he was one of the first to buy what I call disposables, towels that we use, WD-40, things like that we buy in big bulk when you have 7 race teams. And if he does it that way, he can get it far cheaper than if we were all just run to the hardware store and buy a can of WD-40. So those were things that I really saw from him and some of the other teams in the late 2000s that, made a better business model for them to run their teams more efficiently. And one of the things, when I did get to meet him in person and spend some time with him, we talked about, his battery charger business that he took over from his father in the 1960s. And sometimes I chuckle a little bit, because I've heard a lot of people comment that, well, this business was handed to him. And that battery charger business that he had in the 60s was not the battery charger business that he had in 2020. But one of the things he told me one day, we talked about saving pennies. And he said his father taught him to save 1/10 of a penny.
Oh, wow.
And so, and in time, they add up. And that's kind of the way that I always approached being a crew chief on a team. I didn't care if I worked for a guy who didn't have any money, or if I worked for a guy who had an unlimited budget like Coletta and Schumacher. I treated it as if I was paying every bill. And I kind of always went through that model of trying to treat their money as mine. So, that 1/10 of a penny thing stuck with me for a long time. And I still apply that to things that I do nowadays.
Yeah, that hit me, because it's like, average people save dollars, exceptional people save pennies, and he's talking 10s of pennies.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow. How about Don as a man and a friend?
Don as a man and a friend was unbelievable. When the first race I went to him was Pomona, the Winter Nationals in 2010. and my wife was with me, my wife Ellen. And so during that race, a lot of the wives, Don's wife, some other wives that were involved with the team, they've seen enough drag races. So they went to Hollywood and had a nice lunch somewhere, did some shopping while we were all out racing at the racetrack. Well, that very first weekend, the girls included my wife. And she went on far more Dominican Republic trips and all those kind of things than I did, because she was in there before I was. And the first time I ever got invited to either go to Don's house or be included in one of these was like in 2013. And just going to his home and then flying down there with him, and he put us up in these beautiful houses, and we love to play golf down there. And he was the most generous host, wanted to make sure that all of his guests were taken care of. There's a Don Schumacher that is the businessman and the guy you saw on the race teams, and there's a personal side of Don. And when you know Don as a person and personally, he's the best friend you could ever have in the world.
Yeah. You're our fourth interviewee that we have, and that's what we're getting from everyone, that there was, the food never ran out.
Yeah. You were always had a great place to sleep. Nice accommodations. Normally we spent time at their house, but when we went to the DR and places like that, it was in rented properties, and he just rented these unbelievably beautiful properties and just made sure that everyone no one lacked for anything during these trips with Don, or any time that you went to his house, or anytime you were with him.
Yeah. Well, any other either business learnings or human learnings or personal?
Well, he very much valued the employees. I remember in the middle 2000 teens, he had a very big shop, and it was L-shaped like this. Yep. And he wanted to add on to one end of that. And he had already added on to one end of that before when I first got there, but he wanted to add on to it again. And I'll never forget, we were standing there looking out at this field, and it was Mike Lewis, who was the general manager, and me and Don standing there. It was just the three of us. And he looked out there and he goes, I need to add this building so we can do X, Y, and Z. And he looked at me and he said, I'm responsible for 500 people here. And at that time, he only had maybe 100 employees that worked at the race shop. But he was also including the families of these employees that he had. And so not only were the families important, but the employees important, but he took that to another level and worried about their families and their kids and all those kinds of things. So that really taught me that he truly cared about the people that work for him.
Wow. Awesome. Any final words just as a tribute?
It's a huge loss to my wife and myself that he's gone. And he was so impactful on my racing career as well as my personal life. I mean, he enhanced my personal life leaps and bounds, and the opportunities that I had with him, both business and personal, were unbelievable. And had it not been for him, I would have never got to enjoy some of the things or seen the things that I've seen with him. So just a huge loss. And, I don't know that anyone will come along and replace that.
Yeah. It'll definitely be hard to replace. Well, thank you very much for your time and for sharing the story. And we never had an opportunity to interview Don Schumacher on this show, but definitely seems like we've gotten the essence of him and who he was as a person from the interviews that we've done. So thank you very much. And also my condolences for a dear friend.
Well, I appreciate that. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my friend.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ron Tobler.
Thank you.
Our next guest, I grew up watching this man run Pro Stock pretty much most of my life, and then ended up in the factory program with Dodge. So our next guest here on the tribute to Don Schumacher is the cowboy, Mr. Mark Pawuk. Mr. Pawuk, how you doing, sir?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Once again, in the tone of this show, sorry for your loss.
Yeah, Don and I became very good friends, and it was a hard loss for all of his friends. He besides what he did for drag racing, he was a genuine individual who really cared about people, and we built a very special friendship between myself and my wife and my kids over the years.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how did the friendship and our partnership start out?
Well, actually, I met Tony one time. We have my parents had a house in a place in Florida where Don also had a house. And I found out that Tony had lived there or was down there on vacation. So we became friends, and I kind of met Tony through Don, or I'm sorry, Don through Tony. And Don and I became friends. Actually, it kind of started one day we were at dinner at the club, and he walked over and said he was going to the DR like in 2 days, and he would like my wife and I to join him and his wife. So next thing I know, we're on a jet going to the DR. And from there, Don was an avid golfer and fisherman. He did take me out fishing a few times just locally. I'm not a fisherman, but I love golf. So he was definitely my golf partner almost every day when I was down in Florida. And through that, we built a relationship and a friendship. I would start to go over the hospitality areas because I was part of the PRO board at the time. I was just getting ready to go off when Don was coming on, I believe. I quit racing pro stock in 2006, and I came back to factory stock in 2018. So I was I was on Don's plane going up to Daytona when he was getting inducted into the Hall of Fame with a couple of his friends. And Don started beating on me about running this new factory stock class, that he wanted to run a second Dodge car, and he wanted me to be Leah Pruitt's teammate. And I never actually retired from the sport, but I never envisioned ever coming back. Well, I talked to my wife, my kids heard about it, and man, and it didn't stop, especially my son. But even before that, actually, Don, my daughter was looking to do an internship. She was in college, and Don was gracious enough to offer to give her an internship. And my wife and I were leaving on our first ever vacation for our 25th anniversary. And I get a call from Don. We were on the bus one morning going to the airport, and he says, "I have to talk to you about Cassandra." And I'm like, "Oh, great." He goes, "I would like to hire her full time and let her finish her schooling online." So Don
Oh, wow.
actually brought Cassandra into sport. Now my daughter does social media. She works for Natalie Torrance and does social media for a bunch of professional race teams and the factory stock program. So anyway, I decided to come back. I licensed Leah's car in North Carolina in 2018 after the race. And since then, Don and I, our friendship grew. We went on some few golf trips together, and we became very close friends with Don and Sarah, Don's wife, and of course Megan and Chad, his stepdaughter and stepson-in-law. And it just kind of grew from there. And I was in Florida last week, 2 weeks ago, for the first time since Don had passed away. And I had nobody to play golf with. And it really hit home because Don would text me or call me almost every night before and say, "What time we meeting in the morning to play golf?" And we had a lot of family dinners together. And it was just a very, very special friendship. He was a true friend. He really took my entire family in as part of his family. And we did so many things together. And it's just so sad. He's a fighter. He was always a fighter, man. He could be real feisty at times. And I really thought he was going to beat the second go around. I really did, but unfortunately, we got him.
Yeah, yeah. Well, sorry about that. What times were the morning golf? Just so that we get sort of an like indication of what kind of morning person he was.
Well, usually 8 o'clock. That's when the tee box opened. There weren't tee times there, so you go wait in line. But we would always go off early. Don would normally be up early. He loves dogs, so he would be up walking the dogs. And his next favorite thing to do, I think, was getting Starbucks. So he would walk his dogs real early, a lot of times along the beach. He would go to Starbucks and get whatever he drank at Starbucks every day, and then come back. And it was about a half-hour trip to Starbucks. So then he'd come back, and then he'd say, "I'll meet you up at the tee box." And some mornings we hit balls, some mornings we just went right and teed off. But and then after that, a lot of times we would have lunch. One of the special times I had was he invited me down to West Palm, and we went to dinner with Joe Amato and Kenny Bernstein, Kenny and Cheryl. And and Amanda Busick was there, and with my wife and I, Bonnie and we had just the nicest dinner, and it was just a friendship. Actually, one of the trips coming back from Gainesville on Don's jet, Joe Amato ended up catching a ride with us. So him and his wife, and there are a lot of those memories that I have that they're going to be memories forever. It's just I can't even fathom that he's no longer here. He was definitely a very smart man, a very hardworking person, but he had a genuine heart, and he was very nice, and he was a man of his word. If he ever told you anything, you could count it as gold.
Yeah, yeah, I've heard that from many people so far. Tell me a little bit about the business side of Don, and what are some of the things that you learned from him there?
Don was a very intense businessman. He always told me you have to pay people what they're worth, and I've always taken that lesson. And my business, I actually build gas stations for a living. I'm a general contractor. I've been in business for 45 years. I actually started working for my dad and then branched off in a separate division, but he always has been in the petroleum equipment business. And I actually have 2 employees going on 43 years with me this year. So I took Don's recommendations. I used to go to Schumacher Electric once in a while in Chicago, and I've seen the operation. It's very impressive. And then I watched him grow his whole facility in Brownsburg, with DSM, all the machines he's added over the years, and his parts machining business, and all the race teams that he grew, and just very impressive. He would always say to me, this is for sale. Why don't you buy it? And I'm like, Don, there's way too many zeros on that for me, man. I'm not that
Right.
kind I don't have that kind of wealth. But he would tell me all the time, come on, Mark, buy this whole operation, man. You can have the whole package. I'm like, I don't think so, Don.
That's funny. That's funny.
The other thing that Don really loved, and he loved to smoke his cigars. And I talked to him a few times about it, but I think he decided later in life that that's what he enjoyed doing, and that's what he was going to do. But when we would tee off at 8 a.m, man, there'd be a stogie hanging out of his mouth.
That's quite a balancing act. I had my dad, who also has passed away since, used to eat and then figure out how to sleep on a couch with a toothpick in his mouth, and the toothpick wouldn't fall out ever.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing, Don, when we played golf, he was always on his phone. He's always making deals. Always.
On his phone with a cigar, playing golf.
Exactly. What a life, huh? But he didn't drink a lot. He loved lemon drops. My wife would make him a lemon drop, and he'd drink one. He'd go, shoo, shoo, I can't drink another one. But we would sometimes have a lemon drop after we played a round of golf. Not often, but we would, or at dinner. And actually, so we were at dinner right after Don passed away. My wife and I, my son and daughter, and my son's girlfriend, and we all had a lemon drop in memory of Don, because that was his favorite drink. And my wife used to make him something special. He loved Grand Marnier in him, so she would make him that way for him.
Okay, well, I think I'm gonna have a lemon drop with some Grand Marnier in tribute of Mr. Schumacher.
And
later
the salt.
tonight.
You can't forget about the sugar on the rim.
Oh Lord, you're trying. I'm trying so hard. I'm like pre-diabetic. I'm trying so hard here. Trying so hard. Well, any last words for your friend, and just to share to this audience here?
All I can say is there's a hole in my heart. There's a missing person now in my foursome forever on the golf course. And what Don has done for me over the years to help me grow as a person, and my family to grow to where they are, and to bring me back in a sport that I love so much over the years that I never thought I'd come back to. I have to credit him for all of that. He was especially a true friend, and he always called us family. He always told us how much he loved my wife and kids and I, and that we were actually his family. And it just meant the world to me, and the world to my wife, and the world to my kids. So it's definitely going to have a huge void. When I go to the races, it's going to be my first race in Gainesville, where Don's not going to be there, or not going to be around. It's going to be very tough. And I've got something special, hopefully going to be coming out at Gainesville. We'll see, that I'm not going to talk about right now, but hopefully we can get it done in time, and we might have a special presence in Gainesville.
That's awesome. Well, we look forward to it, and that's the main reason for doing the show. It's yeah, it's just going to be hard to go the first NHRA race and without him there. So
Yeah,
um,
there is actually a memorial next Sunday that we were invited to. It's going to be very small. They're going to have a second one in Chicago that's quite a bit larger, and I believe they might be doing something at Chicago racetrack for Don, for a racer appreciation. So it's going to be really tough right before Gainesville to go to that, but you know he'll definitely be in all our minds and all our hearts, along with his family.
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for your time and for sharing the special stories.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's much appreciated, and I really enjoyed the conversation, even though it's tough. I do really appreciate you having me on board.
Thank you. We appreciate it. All right, guys. So there you have it. You heard it from Ron Tobler, and then starting off there in the beginning, Brett Underwood, Cowboy, Mark Pawuk, um, also Jeff Stange, just who the man Don Schumacher was, both as a man and a business person. So thank you for tuning in. Definitely keep him in mind as we watch the NHRA season unfold, and definitely as we start out here in Gainesville. And as they talked about with the lemon drop, I went ahead and got a shot because why not? So here's to you, Don Schumacher, and also here's to everyone else in the spirit of Don Schumacher and having a great racing business. So we'll see you guys next week. Cheers to Don Schumacher, and thank you for a great life well lived. Cheers.